This story is called Xenophobia and the Jewish Druid, and it takes place on Halloween when I was in my late 20s. For a time, I was a practicing druid. I've also studied some Buddhism because I'm a martial artist. And I was raised sort of culturally Jewish, and eventually I just discovered that I am very interested in the origins of the universe and the Big Bang Theory and sort of pulp astrophysics. I am a Jewish Zen pagan with a newish yen for Sagan. Thank you all for coming with me on that Bataan death march to a stupid punchline, just to set up the idea that I was at the time a druid. And on Halloween evening, it occurred to me as a druid that perhaps I should do something to recognize the time. So, as it was nearing midnight, I got in my car in North Hollywood, California, and drove from my apartment to the small park where I had sanctified a grove of trees for my ritual uses. My ritual uses were mostly just that I would go there late at night and put my hands against the bark of the trees and ask them for wisdom. And they would not answer because they are trees. And on Halloween evening, late evening, Halloween night, I drove to my sanctified grove in a park, and I found a place to park right across the street. I got out of my car as a homeless man came down the street toward me carrying a big bag of candy, and he had a ghost mask pushed up on the top of his head, and he smiled at me, and I realized that we live in a bizarre society where there's just one night a year where the homeless can feel like participants instead of pests. So I smiled and gave him a thumbs up, and he smiled and gave me a thumbs up, and I started to cross the street into my sacred park grove, and the homeless guy started to cross the street behind me and to my right on the way into my sacred park grove, and I tried to remind myself that, really, I'm going into a sacred place, everything is fine, nothing can harm me. If he is here with me, he is a friend, everything is fine. I got into my grove, and I began putting my hands to the trees, and the homeless guy came into the grove behind me and sort of walked past me looking at me, and then sat down at the base of one of the trees, began to eat his very sugary dinner in the quiet of the grove as it neared midnight on Halloween evening. And a group of 6 or 7 young Hispanic men, adolescent, enough testosterone to make me nervous, intimidated by their language and their tattoos and their pectoral muscles, and in one case, some visible abdominal muscles that filled me with a sense of high school bullied fear and early onset middle-aged envy. And I saw them gather to drink their long-necked beers, and they stood about 7 feet away from me because I was standing still touching a tree in the middle of the night. They were not aware that I was there. So I felt like a spy, right? I felt like, well, I don't speak Spanish. I don't know what they were talking about. So I felt like an inept, incompetent spy. And the conversation was really getting heated. One was angry with another, and I was starting to feel guilty about eavesdropping, so I stepped away from the tree and I said, "Excuse me, boys," and they went, "Ah!" And I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't intend to frighten you there. I'm a druid, and I'm using this grove right now. And I wonder if you guys could come back in 10 or 15 minutes when I won't be here." And one of them took up a position of vague authority and stepped forward and said, in a tone that may or may not have been threatening, at midnight in a city park, he said, "Excuse me?" And a cold trickle of sweat ran down the side of my neck, and as I took a breath, I felt a second one trickle down my rib cage, where I knew there was no visible musculature. And I remembered in vivid detail an incident that had happened several years earlier in New York City when I was the victim of the world's stupidest mugging. I was 21 years old. Ronald Reagan was president, though he did not know it at the time. I remember I'd gone way uptown to Columbia University to hear a lecture on Reagan's welfare reform proposal, which was based on the oxymoronic economic belief that the best way to discourage people from being poor is to take away their money. And after this really interesting lecture, I came out and walked across town to get a bus, which put me in the lower hundreds in the early 80s, in my early 20s. It was January, so I was in the uh, lower 100s in the early 80s, in my early 20s, and it was in the lower teens. As I sat on a bench waiting on the sidewalk for a bus that would take me downtown, and a large African American man came out of the building behind me. Well, sorry, early 80s, so a big black guy. Oh, and now he would be a big black guy again. Um, for the record, when I do that, that is not some kind of an ironic, sarcastic joke, a reactionary reference to the way the world is too PC and you got to worry about what you say no matter who you're talking to. Yes, I think we should pay attention to what we say about people, and I am a self-aware, unaffected, caring liberal who is willing to go out of his way not just to call people what they want to be called, but to do it appropriately for the period in which I'm describing them. So it was the early 80s, big black guy. If it was now big black guy, apparently if it was in 2005, African American, a large man of African American descent. If I'm telling a story about a little person, it's set in the 20s or 30s. That person is a midget. If it's the 60s or 70s, it's a dwarf. If it is the late 80s, early 90s, there's a little while there that they're vertically challenged. And if I'm talking about them today, they are little people. And on the day that they wish to be called people of small, I will call them people of small. I'm trying. That's all I'm saying. And Denise, I am so sorry I hurt your feelings. I know you are a very sensitive human being. I understand that. I do not mean to hurt anyone ever. But for the first 23 years that I knew you, you were named Dennis. And I worked very hard to make the adjustment in my language to make you comfortable and make you know that you are loved. And now you have started asking me to use they and them as your pronouns, and I don't mind it. But I'm a grammar dork, and I have difficulty using a plural pronoun for a singular individual such as yourself. So please just give me a little leeway to learn it and ingest it, and I may make mistakes along the way. It does not mean that I do not care about you or I do not care about your identity. I love you so much. I just may sometimes say he, she, they. It's like when my mom used to call my sister's name and then my dad's name before she got to me, right after the dog and the hamster. The dog was a basset hound named Arslanga, and the hamster was Vita Brevis. So I'm sitting on this bench with a big black guy next to me whom I have never met, and it is the mid-'80s. And he and I sat together with our breath steaming in the night air as we waited for the bus to come. And after several minutes, he said, give me all your money. And I said, what? And he said, I'm mugging you. Give me all your money. And I said, well, do you have a knife or something? And he said, well, if you want, I could go in and get a knife. I did not want that. So I handed him the $6 that I had in my pocket. And then we sat together waiting for the bus with our breath steaming in the night air. And finally I said, well, no, I can't get on the bus. And he said, oh, sorry. And he held out $1, which was, at the time, the cost of a bus ride in Manhattan. And I took the $1 from my mugger, and I said, oh, thank you. And then we sat together with our breath steaming in the night air. And then the bus came. And it was empty. It wasn't, there was a driver. So it wasn't, that would be a whole different Halloween story. But there was nobody but the driver on a huge woman driving the bus. I put my $1 into the machine. And I thought about saying, you know, this guy just mugged me. But now, she's not the police, and it's $5 he's taken. Feels less like reporting a crime than telling on a guy. So I just paid the $1 and got on, sat down. He paid $1, got on and sat down a few rows behind me and to my right. And after we'd gone several blocks, he tapped me on the shoulder, and I said, what? And he held out $2 of the remaining $4 and said, why don't you just, why don't you take half of this money back? You really always ought to have some cash on you. And that seemed sensible of my mugger, so I took the $2 and I said thank you. And he went back and sat down. And then after several blocks, he rang the bell to signal the driver. That's right. In the 1980s, children, that's how we rang bells in buses. And we we rang the bells and we shouted the news all up and down the aisle. That's not true at all. I'm just sitting alone in my office developing obsolete mime. He 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 made a phone call, and then he pulled a cord that rang a bell that told the driver he wanted them to pull over so he could get off the bus. He taps me on the shoulder, and he holds out the last $2 sort of sheepishly, and he leans over me and he says, why don't you take this last $2 back? I really just needed bus fare. And it occurred to me for the first time that we live in a bizarre society where it's less humiliating to be a criminal than a little short on cash. But by now I felt like I had bonded with my mugger. So I pushed the money back into his hand and said, why don't you hold on to that? You really ought to always have some cash on you. My mugger took the money and said, oh, wow, thank you. Thanks. Got off. We pulled away from the curb, headed down toward Times Square, Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea. But as we pulled away from the curb, the driver apparently caught the end of this conversation in the rearview mirror, because she sort of looked back over her shoulder and she said, you really shouldn't give them poor people money. It only encourages them. And I remembered this entire sequence of events in crystalline clarity as I stood with these young Hispanic men in a loose semicircle around me, the moonlight slanting down between the leaves of my sacred protective grove, and the one that may or may not have been threatening said, "Excuse me? What did you just say to me?" And the homeless guy stood up behind them. He said, "We're Druids." And they went, "Ah!" And he said, "We're using this grove right now. We wonder if you could come back in 10 or 15 minutes when we're done." And the group of young Hispanic men clustered together and spoke very fast Spanish, and the one who had taken up a position of leadership turned back toward me, glancing toward the man with the ghost mask. And then he said, "So like 12:15, 12:30 would be good?" And I said, "That would be fantastic. Thank you very much." And they said, all right, cool, man. Cool, man, have a good time. And they turned away as a group and walked off into the park, drinking their long-necked bottles of beer. And I turned to the homeless guy who had gotten to be a participant instead of a pest. I gave him a big thumbs up, and he gave me a big thumbs up, and then he sat back down to finish his dinner. I turned to touch the tree and thank it for giving me a safe space where nothing could harm me. And the group of Hispanic men stopped several feet off when one of them turned back and said, "Yo, yo, 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 dudes!" Because apparently the shadow had swallowed me again. And he said, "Where did they go? And how many do you think there were?" Happy Halloween, people, if you're watching this during the appropriate time. If you are not watching this during Halloween time, please be happy regardless.